Hello and welcome to Community Forum. My name is Roy Cohen and I'll be hosting again this at-home version of the show. Kind of getting used to it, and hopefully someday when things straighten out and we're able to go back to our home, it'll be nice to go back there again. But in the meantime, we're surviving using Zoom, and today we have a special guest, Andrew Flowers. He's running for state rep and in our district, and very interesting young man, a lot of experience, and he's about to tell us all about it right now. Go ahead, Andrew. Welcome to the show.
Hi, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here. My name's Andrew Flowers. I'm a Democratic candidate for state representative in the 8th Norfolk District, which includes all of Sharon, parts of Walpole and Mansfield, and half of Stoughton, precincts 2, 3, 4, and 6. And it is my pleasure to, for the second time, be on Community Forum. So thank you, Roy, so much for having me. Again, my pleasure to be here. I want to say just a few words about my story, my point in life that got me here, and why I'm running for state representative. I believe that right now, in July 2020, we are at a critical moment in history. Yes, Donald Trump needs to be defeated in November. Yes, we are going through a pandemic and a recession, but there are long-term systemic issues that are boiling up in front of us. Issues like racial injustice and inequality and climate change. So I believe we need to elect a fresh infusion of bold leaders on Beacon Hill, leaders with both the experience, the expertise to get things done, but also the backbone, the willingness to stand up for what is right. My background as an economist and a local leader makes me uniquely qualified for this moment. First, though, a little about me. I grew up in a working class family that struggled. I was the oldest of 5 kids, and we were very nomadic. We moved more than 20 times across 5 states with a lot of near evictions and foreclosures. I saw my parents go bankrupt twice. As a teenager, I worked for my father's janitorial business, waking up before dawn with my brother and him, and we would clean office buildings and retail stores before we raced to school to get to class on time. And fast forward to today, I worked hard and put myself through the University of Chicago, earning scholarships, and I have more than a decade of experience now in both the public and private sectors, including 5 years at the Federal Reserve during the last major recession and financial crisis our country went through in 2008 through 2013. I also more recently was an economist with Indeed.com. Indeed is the world's largest job site. So I know what it takes to help people get jobs, hopefully good jobs, jobs that my parents would have dreamed of. And today I am honored to live in this district. I live in Walpole with my wife, Anna, and our 2 little kids, both under 5, Vivian, who's almost 4.5, and Luke, who's 2. And we love this community. We love it, and we chose to live here because the people are wonderful and the schools are great. My wife, Anna, is from Massachusetts, and so this was a homecoming of sorts for her. But for me, Massachusetts has become more of a home than I've ever known, and I've quickly become a leader in Walpole. I'm the vice chair of the Finance Committee. I chair the Affordable Housing Committee, and I was recently reelected to a second 3-year term as a town meeting representative. I, though, have used my personal lived experience, my professional background as an economist and my time at the Federal Reserve to come before you, the voters, and run for state representative in this moment. And I'm running because, as I said, this is a critical moment in history and urgency is required. And I'm not seeing Beacon Hill match the urgency of the moment, not when it comes to racial injustice or transportation or the economy under COVID or climate change. These long-term systemic issues aren't being solved by the same old status quo politics on Beacon Hill. And I'm not going to accept the status quo, and neither should you.
Well, that sounds great. quite busy. You have time for the family at night. You're just so involved in everything. And I know what that's like, and I wish you well. You're developing quite the background for the position. And when is the election? It's in September. It's a preliminary election.
Yes, that's right. I am running in the Democratic primary on Tuesday, September 1st. You can vote by mail, or early voting begins in person on August 22nd, but the election is September 1st, and that's it. There's actually no Republican or independent on the November ballot. So Stoughton voters, this is your chance for the 8th Norfolk District on September 1st.
Let's talk about the absentee ballot situation. If people are reluctant to go to the polling place because of the pandemic situation, what should they do? If they want to get an absentee ballot, what's the procedure for that?
Yeah, great question, Roy. This year is going to be a little different. Both for the primary and the general election, the legislature passed a law allowing voters to vote by mail. And we're filming this on July 20th. And most voters by today or within the next few days will have received a vote by mail application in the mail from the Secretary of State. And they can return that to their town clerk to get a ballot in the mail. And so if you're too worried about showing up at a polling place, whether for early voting or the day of the election, that is completely understandable. And that's why we have this vote by mail process. So if you maybe lost that ballot application, you can go to your town clerk's website or give them a call, and they'll direct you to a form that you can fill out. It's a vote by mail application. It's very simple. And once you send that in, and you can either mail it in, drop it in a drop box at your town clerk's office, or email it to your town clerk. And if you go to andrewflowers.com/vote for this district, you'll find instructions on exactly how to submit that vote by mail application. And once you do, your town clerk will mail you a ballot, and you have to return it by August 26th, at 5 p.m. is the deadline to return your vote by mail application. Or again, you can vote in person August 22nd through August 28th, or on the day of the election, September 1st.
Interesting. And by the way, when you do get that application, at the bottom, you must remember to sign it. It's very important that you sign it, otherwise it'll be disqualified. And it's also, there's a little emphasis in which there's a red printed arrow at the bottom, which says sign here. And hopefully you'll take advantage of it and not listen to what's going on about voter fraud and this and that and everything else. If those things happen and there's not a whole lot you can do about it, except put the fear of God into these people who try to mess up the ballots whatever way they can. But I think that it's a good way to vote and not worry about catching any disease in the process.
I agree completely. I'm a big fan of vote by mail. I think it's obvious that we should do it during a pandemic, but we should have considered expanding this voting rights ability to vote by mail even before 2020. And there are other voting rights expansions we should consider, like election day registration, where you can, or same day registration, where you can register to vote on the day of the election. I'm glad we're going to have expanded early voting because of the pandemic. I hope that continues to future elections. And in November, funny enough, voters will have a ballot question about ranked choice voting, which I believe is a smart way, especially in primaries, when you have lots of choices possibly, to rank your candidates by your preference so that you don't have the winner have just 20% of the vote or so. So there are lots of ways we can expand voting and make voting both totally legitimate, but also more accessible to more folks in the Commonwealth. And I hope we consider that. I
hope so too. And good luck and congratulations on being the one who broke the ice of non-competitive voting. I think it's been 30 years or so that the current state rep has had the ability just to kind of cruise into it and not worry about running because there was no competition, no preliminaries, no nothing. What was it? It's been 30 years, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right, Roy. It's been 30 years since there's been a serious competitive election in this district. The outgoing representative has been there for 30 years. And as you alluded to, Massachusetts has some of the least competitive elections in the country. And that, I think, is a real problem, a red warning light flashing for our democracy in Massachusetts, and we got to take it seriously. But I believe 30 years ago, there was a gentleman who lost to the current rep. I forgot his name. Can you remind me, Roy?
I think it was me.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
What a campaign that was, and it was a shame because I would have loved to have sat up in the State House and try to do some of the good things that I did as a member of the Board of Selectmen here in Stoughton, which was quite an 8-year period when I was on the board. A lot of things happened then, and a lot of controversy and a lot of stress. But I have no guilty feelings about what we were able to accomplish. And thanks for reminding me about that. I had kind of pushed it off to the side. All right, let's get into some real subjects. Let's start off with transparency. Do you think that there's a need to improve the transparency at the State House, which I understand is one of the least transparency governments in the country? That's terrible.
Yes, absolutely. This is a critical issue. It's one of the big reasons I'm running. And I believe we need leaders, as I said, who are bold and have expertise, but who are willing to have a backbone and stand up for what's right. And the fact that our state government is one of the least transparent in the country means that we need to elect more leaders with a backbone. So what do I mean when I say it's the least transparent among the 50 states? We're the only state, actually, where the governor, the State House, and the State Senate, all three branches are exempt from public records requests, from Freedom of Information Act requests. That's unacceptable. We can do better to open up Beacon Hill, let the sunlight in, let voters and residents see what's happening there. But it goes beyond just public records requests. It comes down to public votes. Too often, good bills on Beacon Hill die in a secret vote. More and more decisions are being made behind closed doors, and I want to bring the debate back out into the open. So for instance, I'll tell you a quick story. Last year in January 2019, there was a vote. It was on the House Representatives scoreboard. And the way it works, there's a big scoreboard with your rep's name and a red light or a green light next to it. And there was a vote, a routine. It was actually an amendment vote. And the presiding officer said, okay, cast your vote. And the speaker's light was red. Well, during the 3-minute period where people were casting their vote, the presiding officer got a message and then on a hot mic said, actually, it's a yes vote. And so the speaker's vote changed from red to green. And you see, just astonishingly, over 60 House Democrats, like a Christmas tree, changed their votes from red to green, red to green. And this follow the leader mentality where when they do take votes on the House floor, they just do what the leadership tells them to. It's a part of this problem of how Beacon Hill is not acting with urgency on issues like climate change and the economy and racial justice. But the root problem, the reason there's a top-down structure of follow the leader mentality is that you can't hold your state reps accountable because Beacon Hill is not transparent. We don't publish basic committee roll call votes. So all too often those bills that I mentioned that get killed in secret votes, they die before committees, where the committees are not required to publish roll call votes. I am the only candidate in this race who has signed a pledge called the Voters Deserve to Know Pledge. It's by act en masse, and it would require that all committee votes be made public. And I truly believe that that increase in transparency is the mechanism to break this follow the leader culture, this top-down hierarchical culture where you can actually hold your reps accountable, because that's good in its own right? We want transparency, period. But it's even better because transparency, I believe, is the key to have pragmatic, progressive solutions on those issues where Beacon Hill hasn't matched the urgency of the moment. So I believe transparency is absolutely critical, and I am the candidate in this race running on transparency. My opponent won't sign this pledge. My opponent has only ever had one employer in his life, and that's Beacon Hill. So he is just going to stick with that status quo mentality of keeping things opaque and behind closed doors, and I want to bring those votes back out in the debate into the open. And transparency is our gateway to progress here in Massachusetts.
It sounds like you'll have an uphill battle in trying to get that enacted.
It's true. There are only 12 state reps who've signed on to that pledge in the House of Representatives. But that's why this election matters, Roy, because while there are 160 reps in the House of Representatives, you only need 10% of them, or 16, to force a roll call vote. So with a few more seats like this race that could flip towards candidates who support greater transparency, we can quickly go from 12 to 16. And when we have 16 reps willing to stand on principle for this issue, we can really begin to force tough votes that get state reps to put their money where their mouth is, because all too often they will sign on to bills as co-sponsors. They will say, oh yeah, to an interest group or to a supporter, they will say, oh yeah, I support that bill, but they will vote in secret at the committee level to prevent that bill from ever moving forward. So year after year, session after session, sometimes for decades, bills will languish at the State House with all this ostensible support by state reps. But really that support is a mirage. It's a status quo mentality where you can try to have it both ways. You support a bill, but you will vote in secret to kill it. And so even though there's only 12 state reps, I hope to be the 13th or maybe even the 14th, 15th, 16th. If we get enough new reps in this cycle, we'll get to 16 and we can really push for greater transparency.
I wish you luck. That's one of the things that I had to fight when I was first elected to the Board of Selectmen. I was in a minority position on the board of 7 members, and it was very, very difficult to make progressive moves when you had the anti-growth group in the majority. But when that changed, things really changed, and then it became more of a pleasure to be serving the community with the right kind of business to move ahead, for sure. There's if you're reading the papers or watching the newscasts, there's a lot of stories coming out about defunding the police. What's your thoughts about that? I mean, what are we going to be, a society without police officers to protect us? What's your thoughts?
I do not support the defund the police movement. I think defunding the police is a bad rallying cry. It's a bad motto. It's bad policy. I believe, simply put, we need professional, trained public safety officers with weapons to protect us. That said, let's take a step back. I believe Massachusetts and really the entire country is facing the long-term systemic issue of racial injustice. And one manifestation of racial injustice, we can talk about education and healthcare and how systemic racism is in all our institutions, from housing and schools and hospitals. But one manifestation is police reform. And there is currently right now on Beacon Hill intense debate about a police reform bill. The Senate passed one last week, and the House is actually set to vote potentially tomorrow, July 21st, on a police reform bill. So when we as a country, after the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many other Black people, even just this year by police, there have been protests. And we as a country are realizing that people are in the streets and they are demanding reform. And rightfully so. I've actually been proud to join them. I've been proud to say that Black Lives Matter and join those protesters in the street to demand greater racial justice. So when it comes to police reform and the issues being debated right now on Beacon Hill, one motto, one rallying cry you hear, as you said, Roy, is defund the police. And again, I don't agree with that. I think we need trained officers, but we can do better in Massachusetts. Once again, Beacon Hill has not matched the urgency of the moment. We are one of only 5 states, Roy, only 5 states that does not have statewide police licensing or a post system, a police officer standards and training system. Many other states, 45 other states, have a system where if you're one of those few rare bad police officers and you get decertified, that most other states have an ability statewide to track that. So you can't hop from one department to another. But we don't have that ability here in Massachusetts. So even our Republican governor, Charlie Baker, supports a statewide post system, a police licensing system. So that's going to hopefully happen on Beacon Hill in the next few weeks before the end of the session. We also need to go further on police reform. We need to have limits on use of force. We need to think about banning no-knock warrants and rubber bullets and tear gas. And we absolutely need to ban chokeholds here in Massachusetts. So limits on use of force, statewide police licensing. We can go further in terms of banning facial recognition technology or biometric surveillance, which to me, this is a no-brainer, right? this is an almost Orwellian technology or a set of tools that have serious civil liberties violations, and they have a lot of built-in racial bias. So banning those tools in terms of law enforcement is another thing that should be included in the bill. But among all these options, you're going to notice that I'm not mentioning defund the police. So to actually answer your question, Roy, I believe that we need to seriously reinvest in social services, whether it's school guidance counselors or mental health professionals or social workers. And honestly, part of the reason people ask or push this notion, even though it's misguided, of defunding the police, part of the reason they push it is we ask the police to do way too much. We ask the police to respond to every domestic dispute or mental health crises when maybe not in a 911 emergency, but in other settings, a different human service personnel is better suited for that response. And so it's not about defunding the police. It's about investing in social services so people can get the help they need, the services they need. So I don't agree with defund the police. I absolutely believe that Black Lives Matter and we need racial justice policies here in Massachusetts. And I support the police reform bills being debated on Beacon Hill to really increase accountability and bring us up to speed with the rest of the states in the country.
I think that in the case of the police departments, there's what 360 of them in the state of Massachusetts. They all have their own ways of doing things. That somehow a policy should come up with a policy of how to do the policing, spread it out so everybody is on the same level, and things won't be as it is now. I mean, there are times when you're afraid to go into a different community because you might think that the police would be a little different in their way of enforcing the law. Somehow we've got to bring all that together. What do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we're going to have police reform that not just standardizes the profession across the state, and not just has limits on use of force, but also requires some racial justice education and some training. Right? We need to enhance our training for police officers about the history of racism and Jim Crow and mass incarceration. And this is actually a key point in the legislation that is both in the House and Senate bills that are being debated right now. Right. We ask police officers to go through hours and hours and hours of training on how to use their lethal weapons, and rightfully so. But they should also be asked to go through some, racial bias training that's more than is required now. And they shouldn't get a bonus for doing this. This should just be expected, as it is for a lot of civil servants. And I think when you have that foundation of training and education, we all know, Roy, that the vast majority, 99% of police officers are great people. They're public servants. Well, that basic level of training, I think, is going to start to be part of the process to increase trust between communities, particularly Black and brown communities that so often feel an antagonistic relationship with the police. It's this training of police officers in Massachusetts on the history of racism can help mend that a misunderstanding. And once you have that trust in communities, to your point, Roy, when you go into a new city or town, you're going to feel more at ease knowing that public safety officials are trained in a standardized way across the state.
Well, they can take care of that in the academy when they're training them.
Yes.
They can take care of that, have everybody learning how to be, how to get along with your citizens, how to handle certain stresses. That could all be taken care of at the beginning. Then maybe think about a refresher course every few years. Like your scouts would go for a merit badge. Well, the police can go for training or merit badges, so to speak, based on things that are happening in this particular day. Like you talk about, what is it, Seattle, where they've taken over 6 or 7 blocks and nobody's doing any enforcing. That's awful what's going on there.
Yeah, it really is. We can't allow anarchy to become the alternative to the status quo, because I believe that that's a false choice. The status quo is not acceptable. We have tremendous racial disparities in this country, in this state, even in this district, when it comes to policing of minorities, when it comes to policing of non-white populations, we can do better, right? So that's why I think the statewide police licensing, the racial justice education, the limits on use of force, these are sensible, common sense police reform elements that should get through Beacon Hill. But again, the alternative is not to just have anarchy. That's why I say I support progressive racial justice policies, but I'm not in favor of defunding the police. So again, I think you're absolutely right. It's not keep things the same or become like a Seattle, lawless area. That's not the choice. The choice is incremental progress towards racial justice and policing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's change the topic into something, I'm not sure if it's more pleasant, but let's talk about climate change. What's your feelings about that? We're watching these glaciers melting away and the water level or the sea level rising. A lot of us are going to wind up with lakeshore property or oceanfront property, unfortunately, in the near future. What's your thoughts about the climate change?
Climate change is an existential crisis, Roy, and it's not a crisis in Australia or in the California forest or in the Brazilian rainforest where there are fires and droughts. It's a crisis here in Massachusetts right now. So let me tell you a story. Last summer, I was on a beach at the Cape with my wife. And like I said, we have a 4-year-old and a toddler. And our kids were playing in the sand on this beach last summer. And we had a great day. And at night, my mother-in-law watched the kids, and my wife and I went out to hear a talk by a scientist who told us, and it shocked us, that very beach, they pinpointed that very beach we were at, would be by 2070 completely underwater due to rising sea levels. Wow. And it just hit us that, wow, our kids in their 50s are going to look back on family photos and see a beach that will have vanished. And for many of the viewers watching now, whether it's your kids or your grandkids or your great-grandkids, their future is at stake. And this is where my frustration comes in. Once again, Beacon Hill is not matching the urgency of the issue. The state legislature hasn't led on climate since the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed way back in 2008. Now, that was 12 years ago, and that was good landmark legislation at the time. There's so much more we can do. And as I mentioned earlier in this interview about bills that languish year after year, session after session on Beacon Hill, despite having ostensibly, wide support among the legislature, this example is in climate change as well. We have bills like 100% renewable energy by 2035, bills like carbon pricing, where you enact a carbon pricing system, you would reduce carbon emissions, and you would rebate a majority of those revenues back to low and middle income households. And then the rest, you would create a green infrastructure fund and put people to work, whether they're going to be wind turbine technicians or solar panel installers. So whether the carbon pricing bill or the 100% renewable energy bill or all these other great pieces of legislation that attract lots of support, the status quo on Beacon Hill has just ignored them, has just punted. The culture is one of inertia and complacency. And we can't have inertia and complacency when it comes to climate. Roy, I am proud to say, and I'll end on this, that my campaign just last week was endorsed by the Sierra Club. And the Sierra Club, along with many other environmental organizations in the Commonwealth, recognize that in this race, I am the climate change candidate. Why? It's not enough just to put forth progressive climate change policies and say that I support that. It's also your expertise. And I have a background as an economist. I worked for the world's largest job site, and specifically, I researched what those green jobs of the future are. I mentioned earlier, wind turbine technician, solar panel installer. We can build a green economy of the future, of the 21st century here in Massachusetts. We have the research universities, we have the biotech and other industries that could support that innovation. We could be a world-class green innovator if we want to, but we have to step up to the plate. We need bold leaders to lead on climate, and that's what I hope to do.
Sounds good. I get a little nervous when I think about the fact that there are some brand new buildings in downtown Boston that occasionally, when there's a a super storm out there, the roads get flooded and the buildings get flooded, and got to do something. Got to build walls or try to do what they do in what, Holland or wherever it is that they protect their property by building walls. Maybe we have to start looking at that in the meantime.
It's a great point, because climate change policy is not just about reducing carbon emissions. And eventually, yes, we should get to net zero carbon emissions at least by 2050, if not to negative emissions by then globally. And Massachusetts should lead by having that net zero carbon emissions goal. But it's not just about reducing carbon emissions. To your point, Roy, we also need to think about adaptation and mitigation, right? So adaptation is to use the example of downtown Boston and how we think about development and zoning. It's having building codes that force developers to plan ahead and adapt to the events we're going to continually see, like superstorms and flooding. But it's also not just adaptation, it's mitigation, which is a little different. It just means knowing that these rising seas are coming, knowing that these droughts and high precipitation events, extreme weather swings are coming. How do we mitigate their effects? Knowing that we're going to go through them in the decades to come, we need to start planning for this. This is actually one area where I want to give both the governor and the legislature a little credit. I know I'm hard on the State House for not stepping up to the plate on carbon emissions, but they have actually tried to encourage local governments at the local level to lead on mitigation and adaptation planning. So we need to continue those investments, because to your point, this is coming. I mean, we see it already, and it's just going to get worse. So let's mitigate and adapt to it, and also stop it from destroying the planet in the next century by cutting carbon emissions.
Sure. I think about the airport. We're going to wind up losing the airport if nothing is done. It's going to become flooded. And I don't know what they're going to do then. It's going to be a major problem. All right, I got a couple other things I wanted to chat about that are starting to bother me. And that is with the cutting of unemployment. A lot of people are relying on that until the jobs open up again. I'm worried about the housing shortage and the fact that, like in the public housing, they're talking about evictions. Lots of them, thousands of them, I would think. That just can't happen. The legislature has got to do something to solve these problems, because all of a sudden you're going to have all these people out on the street, homeless. What are we going to do?
It's a real crisis. And Roy, it's a tsunami that's coming. And I don't think we're quite prepared for it. It's a tsunami of evictions and foreclosures and bankruptcies. Again, as an economist, I've been dismayed to see Massachusetts now have the highest unemployment rate in the country. I've been dismayed to see not just the 8,000 residents in Massachusetts that have died. That's the most tragic part from COVID-19 recession, to 6 million, more than 1.6 million residents apply for unemployment insurance. So it's a tsunami of economic devastation. And you're right that it's going to hit the housing market the hardest. And let's just take a moment to realize that the greater Boston area was in a housing crisis before the pandemic and recession, right? It was a crisis of expensive rents and home prices. People were stretched to their max to afford to live in the community they grew up in or stay in the community that they've lived in their whole life. So let's recognize that there was a housing crisis before this. On top of that, there's the pandemic and the recession. So to your point, how do we prevent these evictions and foreclosures from putting people out and frankly endangering public health even more than is the case? Well, the legislature, or really the governor, first enacted a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures. Right. And it was going to go through, I think, August 18th. And then today on July 20th, I think the governor extended it 2 months to mid-October, which was a good move. And there are bills in the legislature that will deal with this problem more comprehensively. In other words, the bill I support by Mike Connolly, the chair of the housing committee, and Nick Alaguardo and other great progressive housing leaders in the legislature, this bill would say for a year after the state of emergency is ended, and hopefully, knock on wood, who knows, I can't predict the future, but hopefully it ends soon. But from a year from that endpoint of the state of emergency, this moratorium on evictions and foreclosures is going to continue. And this is just a necessity because there are thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands possibly, of people in the state who've lost their job, who, to no fault of their own because of the pandemic, are on a razor edge economically. And we can't force them out into new environments or onto the streets, given this, nearly 20% unemployment rate. Now, does this mean that we just disregard all small landlords and people who expect those rent payments to fund their own business? No. I think we need to have a comprehensive mortgage and rent or mortgage and lease deferment program. So this is not about canceling rent or canceling mortgages or debt relief as if you just get a freebie and you can just squat in your rental apartment for as long as you want. That's not what this foreclosure and eviction moratorium is about. It's about working towards a deferment plan where you still pay the same in rent or on your mortgage, but it's added, it's deferred to the end. It's essentially extended. So the length of the loan, if it's a mortgage, or the length of your lease, you're still required to pay and make good to your landlord or to your bank. But it gives people a break because this is just an unprecedented economic moment and there's devastation all around us. Thousands of businesses are going under. We can't just expect the legislature to allow landlords to kick people out of their homes when, to no fault of their own, they are essentially on the razor's edge economically. So I support extending the moratorium. I support a deferment plan. The legislature has to lead on this. Sadly, I don't see a lot of action, even though there's individual leaders that I mentioned who are doing a great job. I want to see House leadership take up housing as a serious issue because that's going to be one big way this crisis manifests itself.
This is not something that's just happening in Massachusetts. I would assume that the same problem exists in other states. Is that correct?
Yes, there are many other states who are exploring similar policies as what I'm proposing here, whether it's moratoriums or deferment plans. Many states realize that if they don't act now, the push towards homelessness, towards housing instability is just going to snowball. Because as you know, Roy, other states, Texas, Florida, California, are seeing this second spike that luckily, knock on wood, we have yet to see here in the Commonwealth. Hopefully it never comes. But the reality is our country is still not doing a good enough job keeping coronavirus under control. We're seeing cases rise. We're seeing hospital ICU capacity in some states start to max out. Death numbers are not as bad as they were in the spring, but they're still not under control. We really don't have a grip on this virus. So if it eventually comes to Massachusetts, the snowball effect of a housing instability, even in other states, if other states don't deal with this well, it's going to affect Massachusetts. So that's why, again, you can't, in a moment where people need a social distance themselves and have a refuge, a home to go to so that they're not exposing themselves at work or, in terms of housing instability, we can't let these evictions and foreclosures just plow through the economy. It's going to be bad for everyone.
I would think that they would come up with a program where people could apply for funding, just like the unemployment, the $600 a week that they've been getting, or the unemployment itself. Shouldn't people? I would think that people should be able to apply for monies to get themselves caught up, and would not have to worry about being evicted. I mean, that's just a bad situation. Plus, you're talking if it's extended into October, then you're getting into the colder time of the year. And if these people are going to be evicted during the cold time of the year, that's a tragedy.
Yes, and so just to point out what you're saying, it's so important, is that there has been a very generous federal expansion of unemployment insurance benefits. this pandemic unemployment assistance for people who are like freelance workers or 1099 workers, on top of the bonus, the $600 per week of unemployment insurance benefits. That has frankly kept the economy afloat through July. Sadly, though, it's going to expire at the end of this month, and there doesn't seem to be action among at least Senate Republicans to extend this unemployment insurance nationally. So that's what I mean when I say that there is a tsunami of evictions and foreclosures coming, even though by one study, according to the Boston Fed, up to 30% of Massachusetts residents had some kind of informal deal. They were either late on rent or late on their mortgage, but they had some kind of informal deal with their landlord or bank to kind of make do. Up to 30% of the population is having trouble meeting their housing costs this spring. Well, that was during this period where the federal government was pumping $600 more a week in unemployment insurance for those people who lost their job. But that's going to expire. And so that's what I mean when we say extend the moratorium on evictions and foreclosures. It's not just that through mid-August, it should be through not just mid-October, but even further out, because I worry if the federal government is not going to provide more help in the form of extended supplemental unemployment insurance, if it runs out at the end of this month, you're really going to see the economy take a big nosedive.
That'll be unfortunate. I think that as a possible state rep, that maybe you should even think about starting to make some noise in that area and see if you can get the action rolling where people can start to worry less about possibility of being evicted. I mean, you don't have to be sitting in Boston at the State House to make things happen. And I point out as for instance, the recent driving distracted situation. It was successfully monitored by an individual who was not a state rep, Jerry Sibley. And I think that until you get to the point where you're actually elected in November, please, that should happen. Then you can maybe start to think about making some noise now.
I think your point is so well taken. It's not just about the position of power you hope to achieve by being elected. It's really about your effort as an organizer in your community across the state to rally other people, to galvanize them. So you're right, Roy. It's not just about me getting elected to state rep or any one individual leader on the select board or on the school committee or as a U.S. senator, whatever it is. It's about joining people in signing petitions and calling your current legislators and putting pressure on those in power to take bold action to meet the urgency of the moment. Again, I don't see that this gulf of misunderstanding and how paltry our actions are, how weak, how timid I see the response, especially from Beacon Hill. It's not meeting the moment. So to your point, I whether I'm elected or not, win or lose, I'm going to be signing petitions, pushing legislators to be bold and putting forth my own ideas in terms of policy of what can be done. Because this is going to be a rough few months and hopefully not, but possibly even a few years during getting the pandemic under control and suffering from this recession. We're going to have to come together as a community and really ignite a passion for activism to do the right thing.
Sounds good. I wish you luck in that area. Let's talk about transportation in the remaining time. There's I'm sure that the ridership has dropped drastically. When I go by the train station in Stoughton, until the pandemic came alive, if I could put it that way, the parking lot at the train station was always full. Now, over the last few weeks, when I go by the train station, there may be 5 or 6 cars that are sitting in there where people obviously have taken the train. What can we do in that area to help the chief, for one thing?
Yes, when I launched my campaign for state representative in January, I identified transportation as the top issue because our transportation system is in crisis. We have had, through public transit, a system that's neither safe, reliable, or affordable. It has over 40 derailments in the last 5 years. And gridlock, as you know, is among the worst in the world. It's the worst. Boston rates is the worst gridlock traffic in the country and the 8th worst in the world. So we had delays on the commuter rail, we had derailments, we had traffic on 93, 95 on all our roads. This was a crisis in January, and then coronavirus hit. So to your point, Roy, people are going to be tempted to not want to solve these long-standing transportation issues just because ridership is down during the pandemic. Now, go back to the last recession in 2008 through 2010. That's actually the last time ridership increased here in Boston, whether it was the T, the bus system, or the commuter rail. So during recessions, when the pandemic actually gets resolved or when people begin to go back to work safely on public transit, I expect ridership to increase. And we haven't fixed the long-standing infrastructure problems. Now, to take a step back, I want to recognize that Massachusetts used to historically be among the best places in terms of public transit. It used to be a way we led in the world. Well, that's no longer the case. As you said, the MBTA, it's in shambles, and our gridlock is the worst it can be. We can catapult Massachusetts back to be among the best public transit systems in the world, but we have to start with smart investments. So for me, I look at what the State House did. They approved an $18 billion transportation bond bill in early March. I would support that coming through the Senate and getting it done. Now, a bond bill doesn't mean actual spending. It's just authorization for the governor to borrow in debt at the state level and make those investments and improve roads and bridges and upgrade existing infrastructure like on the MBTA or other regional transit authorities. But a bond bill is not enough. So I'm glad the House did that in early March. But they also passed something more remarkable. They actually raised some revenue, $500 million, $500 million in revenue dedicated to transit improvements. And this has been sorely needed for years now. Transit advocates have been asking the State House to raise some revenues. Now, they did this by a 5% increase in the gas tax, which, by the way, has not changed in 25 years. It's lower than, I think we're 33rd of the nation in terms of our gas tax. So there are a lot of states, Alabama recently passed us as having a higher gas tax. So a gas tax in Massachusetts, yes, a lot of people don't like paying 5 cents more per gallon at the pump, but look at the gas prices. They've gone down 50 or 60 cents just this year because of the recession. So I think a 5% increase in the gas tax, along with other fees, such as Uber and Lyft fees for ride-hailing companies, these revenues are needed to invest in transit. Now, one last thing I'll say before I stop is a lot of people point out that ridership is down during coronavirus as a reason not to invest. Actually, I think now is the perfect time because ridership is low. It's going to eventually come back when we defeat this pandemic. Because ridership is low now, it's going to be the least disruptive to increase our transit assets in terms of their increase our investments in our transit assets right now. The delays and dysfunction around improvements are actually best done right now when ridership is down, because we're going to need a world-class transportation system in a year or two. The Boston economy is going to crumble if we don't, right? Because a lot of business groups like the Boston Chamber, Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce have been calling for higher taxes. They've been calling, believe it or not, business groups for more transportation revenue to invest in the system because it's too frustrating in terms of recruiting workers or operating your business when you can't count on your workers arriving on time. They're stuck in traffic or the commuter rail is delayed. So long story short, transportation still is a top priority for me, even though it seems like the legislature is going to punt once again on these long-term systemic issues. They're just going to wait to try to fix it in 2021. And I think that is a mistake.
I personally don't see what the problem is with a dedicated tax on the gallon of gasoline. The prices of gas have changed in the last month or so, like 50 cents, and nobody's complaining. It's just that's the way it is. If they say, okay, we're going to raise the gas tax 5 cents, and that's going to go towards the transportation needs dedicated, and they can't use that money for anything else. I don't see any problem with pushing something like that, as long as it's monitored.
Absolutely. And I think that's where, the economist in me comes in here. It's not just about more money, more investments. That's part of the solution, sure. It's also about more fiscal control. And I'll be honest, Roy, the MBTA has serious budget issues, and the Fiscal Management and Control Board, the FMCB that the governor put in place to oversee the entire commuter rail system, that control board is needed because, I mean, we have expensive, $200,000 consultants that we, work one day a week helping ETA in terms of their development. There's lots of cost overruns in the system that could definitely be cut. I don't want to make it seem like there's no fat to trim, but to do transit investments right, we're going to need new revenue. But to get that revenue from taxpayers, we need to justify to them that we're being good stewards of their money. And I think the current MBTA lived up to that.
Unfortunately, we run into some technical problems with Zoom, but it's minimal, so I guess that's okay. There's a couple of other things that are going on that bother me quite a bit. One is there's plans to spend billions of dollars on the turnpike where in the Boston University area. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
It's something you might want to look into. They just spent a whole lot of money fixing up that whole area once they took down the toll booths. And it seems to go pretty good. Now they're talking about straightening it out and moving Starrow Drive and doing all kinds of stuff. I think that money should be put into better use someplace else. That road is working okay. That's something you might want to take a look at. What about transportation, Boston to the Fall River, New Bedford area? Yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that the South Coast Rail project has had a long and troubled past. The idea as it was conceived may have had good intentions, but and the good intentions were to increase economic development in Fall River, connecting people to the Boston corridor, but ultimately a few flaws in the whole South Coast Rail project. One, the ridership projections don't seem realistic, that people are really going to commute 90 minutes one way between Fall River. Yeah. Demand for it. Second point, though, is how it affects Stoughton. Stoughton specifically is going to get ripped up by the South Coast Rail project. The downtown of Stoughton would potentially be destroyed by South Coast Rail. And I think there has to be mitigation. There has to be a rerouting, as they did in Easton around 138. There's ways to reroute the South Coast Rail project that respects wetlands, but does not just destroy the downtown Stoughton area. So in my point of view, I actually support public transit projects in theory, like South Coast Rail, because I believe in investing in a world-class public transit system. And we're gonna have to take carbon emissions down in the transportation sector. That's the largest source of carbon emissions in the state at over 40%. But to the specific issue of South Coast Rail as a project, the way it's going to disrupt downtown Stoughton is unacceptable to me, and I would push for mitigation efforts.
How about this for an idea, which I've thought about over the years when I think about them coming and destroying the town and other towns and upsetting where the frogs live in various ponds and stuff. How about thinking about a monorail down the center of Route 24? It's a wild idea, but just go to Disney and see how they manage it. Go to Chicago and see how they run transportation down the middle of the highway. Is that something you'd consider?
I have not considered that yet. I'm not dismissing it. I think that's a really intriguing idea. And I like that creativity. I have not studied the issue of a monorail on 24 yet, but I think it's a great suggestion. And as an economist, as someone who likes to dive deeply into the research and the data on transit projects or education or healthcare policy or what have you, I would be delighted to explore this idea further. But I haven't actually encountered a serious proposal for that, but I would like to research it.
Think about it. And you can also, since you're going to do some research in that area, take a look at Santa Monica, California. I believe they've finished a railroad or transportation going down the middle of the highway. It's dead space. Utilize it. You know?
Yeah, no, I think, as someone who lived in Chicago before, I went to the University of Chicago for college and would ride the L and see many streets in Chicago with car traffic below, a CTA train. It can work.
I'll give you one more pet peeve that I have. I think that some of these roads, the way they've been designed, are reasons why there's traffic jams. When you leave 128 going up to Route 24, you have a two-lane road coming onto Route 24, meeting another two-lane road coming down Route 128 onto 24, and you have a merging area which jams up the traffic. One of them has to be brought down to a single lane, and hopefully things would smooth out from there. There's a few places like that. When you think about coming off of Route 24 onto Route 128, it's a single lane and it merges nicely. The designer, whoever came up with these merging areas, I think needs to go back to design school. That's my personal opinion. We have a minute and a half left. I want you to tell me why you should be elected and why people should remember to vote for you on September 1st.
Thank you, Roy, for having me. Thank you for the viewers for tuning in. Ultimately, I want to earn your vote on September 1st because I have the experience we need. Yes, it's the professional experience from the Federal Reserve and from being an economist at a tech company. Sure, that helps. But I also have the personal experience of growing up as a working class kid in a family that struggled. And yeah, that helps because that struggle gave me urgency. And urgency is what we need of crises to fix. And Beacon Hill doesn't just seem up for the job. Too often, they're dragging their feet. The culture of a top-down, non-transparent leadership system is just not working for us. We could do so much more. We could make Massachusetts a leader in fighting climate change. We could develop a world-class public transportation system. We can revitalize our economy under this COVID recession while still respecting the health and safety of everyone, and especially students and teachers. As we reopen schools potentially this fall, we have to keep their safety top of mind and be guided again by data and science. And so my background as an economist and a local leader makes me uniquely qualified for this moment. I'm not going to settle for the status quo politics on Beacon Hill, the insider games of back and forth, horse trading. I won't settle for the status quo, and neither should you.
Okay, Andrew, I thank you very much for a very informative 1 hour session. Hopefully, if you make it through the preliminary, we'll get you on again and you can start to tell your story in more detail. I want to thank Mike Hammond, CJ Mullen, Dave Young, and Rob Rotella for their work back in the studio. And hope you enjoyed this at-home version of the Community Forum show. And we'll see you again shortly.